So the biopsychosocial approach is the best way of viewing people, viewing animals, really the best way of viewing the world because it takes into account all of the different components that make up who we are. That being said, obviously not everyone in psychology can look at us from all those perspectives at all at the same time. And so there are within this like larger three main levels of analysis more specific approaches that are not going to take an integrated view, but are going to look at maybe one small facet of who we are. So we're going to go through each one of these approaches. Almost all of them are still currently utilized today. There's one, the humanistic, which is historically relevant, but not really taken up by anyone. And as we go through them, you want to really make sure that you fully understand how each of them are different from each other and maybe how some of them might overlap. I'm going to give you the explanation and I'm also going to apply it to a topic. We'll stick with depression. That's what we did in the biopsychosocial video. But these are approaches that you're going to see again and again and again and again throughout your introductory psych course. So you're going to want to be sure that you can really take ownership of them, that you can apply them to novel examples, that you can, take a single topic and think, how would a psychologist from this approach this topic? What kinds of questions would they ask? What kind of answers would they be seeking? What kind of things would they prioritize in their research? So first big approach is the behavioral approach. And hopefully there are some recognition bells going off in your mind right now because we already learned about this when we talked about John Watson and B.F. Skinner. The behavioral approach is going to be looking at observable behavior and really talking about how do we acquire new behaviors or why do some behaviors go away. Ultimately, behavior psychology is going to be looking at principles of learning. So the types of things that a behavioral psychologist would be interested in would be, how does the environment affect someone? And by environment, I mean different triggers in the environment for certain behaviors. How do consequences affect behaviors? Um, if we took depression as an example, a behavioral psychologist wouldn't be interested in looking at, what you're thinking when you're depressed. A behavioral psychologist would want to know, okay, well, what situations seem to trigger depression? Are there certain environmental triggers for that? Or even how does your own behavior in terms of posture or facial expressions, how might that interact with feelings of depression? They would really be looking at external things and things that you could see and you could measure. A lot of talks of rewards and punishments in behavioral psychology, going along with the whole idea of principles of learning. Second perspective is the biological perspective. This is going to be the scientific study of the links between biological and psychological processes. So a biological psychologist would be looking at things from the genetics that you have to your brain chemistry and how your different neural components work with each other to your hormonal system. With depression, a biological psychologist would be looking at what neurotransmitters are heightened or lessened in the experience of depression. A biological psychologist would say, in order to treat depression, we should prescribe a medication and interact with you on a chemical level. So a biological psychologist is all about the physiology and really the biology and the chemistry of who you are. A cognitive psychologist is very different from the past two that we've talked about, but I will warn you, sometimes people can confuse cognitive with biological, and I'll explain why in a second. Cognitive psychology is all about the scientific study of the mental activities associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, communicating, problem solving. What sometimes people get mixed up on is they hear cognitive and they think thinking and they think the brain, because we know that your brain enables thought. But we want to be careful here. A biological psychologist studies the brain as an organ. A cognitive psychologist studies all the things that the brain does, but they don't really talk about the brain. So in terms of depression, a cognitive psychologist would say, all right, let's look at what thoughts are going through your mind when you're depressed. What are those internal sentences that you're saying to yourself? How does one thought lead to another thought? They would be looking at thinking, but they would not be looking at your brain. An evolutionary psychologist is going to be looking at thoughts and behaviors as adaptive processes. So this is the study of the evolution of behavior and the evolution of thought using principles of natural selection. So an evolutionary psychologist might look at something like depression and say, all right, it's really, really common. Why is that? Is there something about depression that actually on some level helps the species survive or thrive? And there might be a protective function, for example, with depression. I'm not saying it's a good thing for any individuals, but as a species, when you're depressed, you tend to, engage in less risky behavior and maybe keep to yourself a little bit more. That means that your genetic code isn't being put in these risky situations, and it might be more apt to continue on to the next generation. Humanistic psych is historically relevant, but it's not super common anymore. So psychologists like Maslow and Rogers, who created humanistic psychology, were really focused on how do people meet their needs for love, for fulfillment, for acceptance, and how do people really achieve their full health and happiness. So a humanistic psychologist would certainly view depression as something that was an obstacle to achieving your full potential. And they'd maybe want to know, in what ways does depression get in the way of someone becoming self-fulfilled? Um, Next, we have psychodynamic, which, as we go through the course, you'll see is sometimes similar to or referred to as psychoanalysis, and we'll talk about the nuanced differences between that later on. But the psychodynamic perspective is going to be really interested in looking at your childhood. What effect does your childhood and your past have on your present self? And also really interested in the unconscious mind, which is why I've shown a picture of an iceberg here. As we'll learn in psychoanalysis, one of the ways of thinking about the unconscious is thinking of your mind like an iceberg. That so much of who you are is underneath the surface of the water, and that's your unconscious, and it's really driving who you are. So a psychodynamic psychologist would look at depression and would ask questions like, okay, were there any traumatic events that happened in your childhood that are creating this depressed state? Or they would say your depression is the result of unconscious conflict and stuff that you don't have access to, but that's driving these feelings. And a psychodynamic therapist would try to get at that unconscious stuff to help you in the future. Last but not least, we have social cultural, which is going to be looking at how your social context affects your behavior and your thinking. A social cultural psychologist is really interested in the differing rates of disorders around the world. And is interested in looking at taking topics like emotion and asking, do we experience emotions the same way? Or does that differ depending on our culture? So a social cultural psychologist would look at depression, and they would be very interested in looking at, do rates of depression differ between the Eastern world and the Western world? Or do men and women experience depression differently? It's really about taking a global perspective and doing a lot of compare contrast.